Chapter 2 of Letters from Mrs Palmerstone to her daughter, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Anne Fletcher. Chapter 2. Maria Mortimer, or the Fatal Effects of Curiosity. My dear Eliza, a few days since, a lady well known to you was quietly occupied with her daughter in their usual lessons, when the door of the dressing-room was suddenly opened by an old, faithful, and cherished housekeeper, who, in great agitation and with eyes inflamed by weeping, begged her lady's permission to speak to her of an affair of much consequence, and which admitted of no delay. "An affair, madam," added she, again bursting into tears, "ruinous to me and my poor son, unless your goodness and counsel save us." The lady instantly rose from her seat, took the hand of the poor trembling housekeeper, and placing her by the fireside, assured her that she had nothing to apprehend in any affair in which her comfort and services could be useful and effectual. Then turning to her daughter, she said, "You will retire, my love, and as you go to the music-room, tell James that I am particularly engaged and must not be interrupted by any one." The young lady slowly and reluctantly withdrew, eyeing the housekeeper with the most eager curiosity. Before the good woman had had time to collect herself sufficiently to begin, or to preface an affair intimately connected with the welfare of her family, the young lady again appeared. She had forgotten to ask her mamma whether she was to practise the new lessons for the harp, or to play those she knew on the pianoforte. The mother, with mildness but seriousness, said she might do both, for that she would ring when it was necessary for her to return. In something less than half an hour the door of the apartment was again opened, and on tiptoe advanced the above-mentioned restless damsel. She begged 10,000 pardons. She wouldn't stay, but she believed Haydn's concertos were in the room. She could find them in a minute. She was permitted in silence to look for them, and the search was a work of time, but successful at last. She then replaced everything in the most exact order, and glancing a side look at her old friend's flushed countenance, once more quitted the room. The lady had, however, by this time learned the cause of her housekeeper's trouble. It was a perplexed and delicate business in itself, and required further discussion, which they had hardly begun when the inquisitive spy again stood before them. James had sent off Mrs. Beaumont's carriage. She was in it, and certainly came with the purpose of carrying them to see the exhibition, as she had engaged to do. She had told James he was wrong. He said he'd delivered his lady's orders, and Mrs. Beaumont had left her compliments and would dine with her. The lady, with some asperity of manner, said she was very glad that short memories did not infect all the family, that James had done his duty, and that the next time she gave him similar orders they should extend to intruders within the house as well as to those without. The young lady, abashed, left the room, and when she again appeared, her eyes exhibited as strong marks of sorrow as those of the poor woman who had quitted the apartment. I am not quite certain whether my Eliza will enter into my motives of tenderness for introducing a subject of reprehension in the manner which I have adopted, but I am convinced that she has been sensibly touched by the disgrace she has incurred with her mother. But has my dear girl paid due attention to the cause of this disgrace, or the motives which led her into a forgetfulness of her habitual circumspection? I know she cannot impose on her understanding if she fairly weighs the question, and I am sure she will employ no subterfuge for truth. You wished to know Mrs. Clarke's secret, and this desire not only entirely diverted your attention from your own concerns, but also rendered you an impertinent intruder on those of others. We will, my dear child, now consider the claims this curiosity has to indulgence, and the gratifications it has to give in return. The motive which stimulates us to pry into the concerns of others is with some the importance they annex to the knowledge of these affairs. No sooner are they in possession of a secret than they begin to weigh their wisdom, their consequence, and their superiority. They think they have the advantage over the person whose secrets they have discovered. Some there are who have still more unjustifiable views, but these I will pass over, and consider a little more particularly the common herd of secret hunters. 99 times out of 100, the secrets which are so eagerly sought for would neither interest the parties concerned nor repay the time and trouble lost upon them, were it not for the idle satisfaction of repeating them, with those inferences and comments which self-conceit suggests. I call this, my Eliza, an idle satisfaction, but I might have used harsher language, for we must know very little indeed of the duties of life if we are ignorant that we are answerable for all the consequences arising from divulging a secret committed to our keeping. And what is more, whether the intelligence be obtained directly or indirectly, the obligation on our discretion is the same, if we wish to avoid exciting distrust, hatred, and contempt. The following little narrative will evince the truth of this observation, and will, I trust, convince my child that curiosity demands a greater proportion of wisdom than ordinarily falls to the lot of those who are most disposed to indulge its craving and restless suggestions. My godmother lived at Bristol, but she had a beautiful house at Clifton, in which she usually spent the summer months. This lady was also my mother's aunt, and this double tie, with her amiable qualities, produced an intercourse of the most affectionate kind between my mother and herself. We frequently passed 2 or 3 months with her at Clifton, and the last time I enjoyed that pleasure I was nearly of your age. In the autumn my mother engaged her aunt's promise of spending some of the winter months with her in town, but this promise was conditional. I was to be the companion of her journey, and an inmate with her until she could leave Bristol, which it was inconvenient to her to do before the middle of January. This point, as most others, she carried easily with a niece who loved her as a child, and I was left with many injunctions of her not spoiling entirely her pet. My godmother, I suspect, did not very scrupulously observe my mother's orders, for the Christmas holidays were passed in a style of gaiety to which I had hitherto been a stranger. Balls and suppers succeeded each other in rotation, and my godmother wisely thought that a girl who saw not her bed before midnight had little inclination for lessons the next morning. I was therefore permitted to amuse myself as I pleased. Within a few doors of us lived Miss Maria Mortimer, a girl of my own age. I constantly met her in our evening parties, and her vivacity and good humour delighted me. I frequently carried her with me to the place of appointment, and the same carriage conveyed us to our respective homes. She became my morning guest, and the favourite of my godmother, because her Angelica liked her, and she was good-natured. The impressions of kindness and mutual goodwill are not easily effaced from the youthful heart. The death of my godmother in the following year prevented any further opportunity of my seeing Miss Mortimer, but I remembered her with affection and regretted the loss of her acquaintance. Many years after, I met with a lady whom I had known whilst at my godmother's, and I availed myself of the occasion to make inquiries after my friend Maria. "I shall pass the day with your mother to-morrow," said she, "and I will then give you the history of your lively companion. You will be sorry to hear of her present situation." I was, as you, my Eliza, may easily conceive, tormented with my conjectures during the intermediate space of time. The morrow at length arrived, and our guest began as follows. "I believe," said Mrs. Litchford, "you never saw Mrs. Dormer, the aunt of your young friend? Her close confinement to her room, owing to an accident in her youth by which her hip was dislocated, rendered her quitting it extremely painful to her, and I think at the time you were at Bristol she had too many visitors in her own way to be troubled with 2 lively romps. Maria Mortimer was left to this lady's care whilst yet in her cradle. Mrs. Dormer loved her sister, the last surviving parent of the infant Maria, with an undivided affection. She was a single woman, her fortune considerable, and her natural disposition excellent. The misfortunes which had succeeded her sister's marriage threw the little orphan entirely on her protection, and this circumstance gave to her claims additional force in the heart of her aunt. I was at this period on terms of intimacy with Mrs. Dormer, and the daily witness of the tender regard she had for her niece. At that time her love of society counteracted the inconveniences of changing her place, and she frequently visited in her particular circle. But a rheumatic fever, adding to her former lameness, rendered this indulgence too painful, and she was contented to enjoy health and ease in her bedchamber. I had hoped that in her vigilant cares for the infant my good friend would have found a check for a weakness which considerably diminished her respectability and took from her understanding its genuine worth. But in proportion as her bodily activity became impeded, that of her mind seemed to increase, and her love of tittle-tattle to acquire more and more power over her good sense. Her temper naturally cheerful, and her spirits unbroken, it frequently appeared to me that she thought of her particular infirmity only as an evil which opposed her researches after news, nor considered her seclusion from the world as a further misfortune than as it prevented her from seeing all that was doing in it. My talents in this way by no means equalled my regard for my old friend, and I soon discovered that I might, without offence, employ those I had in my little circle of domestic cares, for Mrs. Dormer was happily supplied with friends much better qualified than myself for the office of public intelligencers. The favours and the welcome these received perhaps stimulated their zeal and quickened their invention, for it is certain that Mrs. Dormer knew of events before they happened, and was minutely informed of many that never happened at all. But no human felicity is permanent. My poor friend discovered this truth as painfully as those who meet it in much weightier concerns. It fell out from time to time that her faithful gossips were allured from her by other newsmongers. Sometimes their gleanings were too scanty, and at others too important to be exhibited in Mrs. Dormer's bedroom. In the first instance, petty quarrels and little jealousies sometimes produced dissensions, and Mrs. Dormer was left to solitude. These accidental privations of her accustomed gratifications were heavily and impatiently sustained by the old lady. Placed in her easy-chair by the window, she passed the hours in fretful conjectures. Her next-door neighbour gave a dinner. She saw the guests, but what could the entertainer give them? The season for fowls was over, their cook couldn't fry a sole, and the mistress of the house was a mere dawdle who knew nothing. The postman left a letter at the opposite house. Who could it be for? She had frequently observed the chambermaid officiously receive letters at Mrs. P.'s. She doubted not but the hussy was in some secret with the young lady. Not a bundle or a bandbox could escape the vigilant eyes of Mrs. Marjorie Dormer. To find out what these contained exceeded her power, but I do assure you that she has frequently dispatched a servant to follow the person who carried them to the house they were destined for, and if the bearers could on any pretence be brought before her, they were questioned and dismissed with some little order to their employer. You will not be surprised that the natural curiosity of a lively and acute child should not remain inactive in the hands of Mrs. Dormer. Maria lisped the nursery news to her aunt, and in proportion as she understood the value of her communications, became a spy in every corner of the house. It so happened that some intelligence she had carried to her aunt affected the interests of the housekeeper, whose influence was not to be controlled with impunity, and Maria was sent to a good day-school in the neighbourhood, as something more in Mrs. Housekeeper's favour than her being always in the way, but far short of her wishes to see her removed to a distance. The indulgent aunt would not part with her, and to content her gouvernante ordered a parlour for the particular playroom of Maria, and left to the housekeeper the care of confining her to that apartment when not with her. This regulation produced others, and Maria found that she had now the liberty of entertaining her own company. Soon after you knew her, she became very fond of Miss Baxter, a girl nearly of her own age, and not only her schoolfellow, but near neighbour. This child was the daughter of a very respectable merchant, her mother one of the most estimable women in Bristol, and such was the conduct of the family that it had imposed restraint even on Mrs. Dormer's coterie. For domestic harmony, a judicious economy, and elegant ease met every inquiry and checked every animadversion. Fanny was the only daughter in a family consisting of 6 children, and the fond mother, pleased with the companion of her child's choice, facilitated an intercourse she conceived useful to both the girls. Maria one afternoon expected her friend, and with much impatience found she had greatly exceeded the usual hour of appointment. On Fanny's entering the little parlour, Maria hastily approached to chide her delay, but joy and kindness mingling with this reproof, she eagerly drew nigh her to untie her bonnet, which the wearer was languidly and slowly attempting to do. She was struck by the appearance of a face swelled with weeping, and by an air of sadness which in an instant repressed her own vivacity. But pity and sympathy soon yielded to curiosity, and soothing kindness to questions. Had she disobliged her mamma? Had she lost or broken anything? Had her brother and she quarrelled? Was not her mother rather harsh? Had her papa been angry with her? She thought he appeared to be very severe. Poor Fanny, whose tears had flowed unrestrained and in silence, was now roused to reply, her mother harsh and unkind? Her papa passionate and severe? Her mamma was all goodness, and as to her father, she had never seen him in a passion but once in her life. The tears of Fanny had given place to the glow of offended love, and she looked with resentment on Maria, who, heedless of the sentiments which she had produced, with eagerness pursued her interrogations. She was glad Mr. Baxter was so good-humoured, but how did it happen that he was angry, and when was this, and how was this? Followed with Maria's usual vivacity. "Some time ago," answered the unsuspecting Fanny. "It was when my mamma was so dreadfully ill." "Well," said Maria, "that is very strange. Was he not sorry then?" "Oh, dear me, to be sure he was," answered with simplicity the amiable girl. "It was his grief which put him into a passion, for he thought my mamma was dying." "Well, how was it?" asked Maria. "Why," replied Fanny, "my papa was absent, and my brother persuaded mamma to let him ride the new pony which had been bought for him. We all went to spend the day with Mrs. N, a little way beyond Clifton, and went in the coach. But George begged so hard to go on his pony that my mamma consented, and the footman assured her that a child of 4 years old could govern him. On returning home, all in a moment, we perceived the pony galloping by the coach window without a rider. I shall never forget my mother. She sunk back in the coach, and I thought her quite dead. George had been thrown from the horse, and his face was covered with blood when the servants brought him to the coach. My mother just then opened her eyes. She sighed deeply and fell into another fit. Mrs. P. fortunately returned to Bristol with us. I think I should have died with terror had she not been with us. She desired the coachman to make haste home, and my poor mamma was carried upstairs and put to bed. But she was so ill that Mrs. P. sent off a servant to fetch my papa, and the whole family was in sad trouble. The next morning Mrs. P. had us all into the breakfast-room. She'd been up the whole night with mamma. She was very kind to us, and comforted poor George, whose face was sadly cut, and told me I should see my mother, who was out of danger. After we had breakfasted, Mrs. P. led me into my mother's room, and told her, smiling, that she had brought a poor little weeping girl to see her, who would stay with her till she went home to change her linen. My dear mamma did not speak, but kissed me so kindly that I could not bear it, and I went to the other side of the bed. In this moment my papa came into the room in his boots, and his hair all in disorder with the rain and the hurry of riding all the night almost. My mamma spoke so faintly that I couldn't hear what she said, but I was quite terrified to hear my papa say with much anger, "The cursed blockhead!" and then, "I will never forgive the rascal," and then, "He shall go this very hour." I crept to the curtain, and I heard my mother's sweet voice. She said, indeed, it was all her fault. The poor fellow will break his heart, and she wept. My papa's anger was quite gone, and he now comforted her, and said 1,000 tender words to her. But he told her that he could not yet pardon John, for he knew, although she did not, that the pony had thrown my brother a month before, and that he had then received positive orders not to permit George to mount him till he had been better broken in. So, thank God, my mamma got well, and my good papa forgave John and my brother. But now, said she, sighing, we're all unhappy again. The artless account Fanny had been induced to give from her wish to justify her father by no means appeased the cravings of Maria's curiosity. Something yet remained untold, and she now tried to subdue the instinctive prudence of Fanny by attacking her heart. Friends like themselves ought to have no secrets unshared. She that loved her so dearly might surely be trusted. She might depend on her not speaking of anything she told her, for that was odious. "I've nothing to tell you," said the weeping girl. "I cannot find out what is the reason my mamma is so uneasy, and that it is which makes me unhappy. We met as usual this morning at breakfast, for my dear papa says he is never at home unless his children are around him. We were all as gay as larks when a letter was delivered to my father. The man who brought it was called an express and had travelled the whole night. My father, on reading it, turned as pale as ashes, and his hand trembled. He sunk back on the sofa, and my mamma, terrified, bade us to leave the room, for that our father was ill. "Send Mr. Jackson hither," added she to me, "and do you remain in the hall, Fanny, and take care that no one enters. Your father may sleep." I obeyed, and shortly after my papa and our head clerk set off in a post-chaise and four. Mr. Jackson said, as he passed the hall, he was going to London. I now crept upstairs to my mamma. I heard her shut her chamber door hastily, but on approaching it found it ajar. The bolt had not slipped. I believe my mamma did not hear me enter, for she was stretched on the bed and sobbing. She groaned and said, "My dear children, what will become of my children?" I approached the bed, and she started with surprise. "Is it you, my Fanny?" said she. "Oh, leave me, my love. Your father's hasty journey has been too much for me. I will try to compose my spirits. Take care that no one comes into my room." I retired and watched at the door till I heard my mother's steps in the room, and I tapped. She opened the door, and I was astonished to see her dressed as usual for dinner, the time for which was nigh. She spoke to me with cheerfulness, but I saw she was yet very uneasy. She sat at table with us, but did not eat a morsel, and said nothing but a cup of coffee would relieve her headache. I would have stayed with her, but she said, No, I'm better by myself. You must go. On no account would I have you disappoint Maria." And the tears which fell from her eyes almost suffocated her. She tried to smile, and said, "I'm quite a child to-day. This nervous complaint must be humoured." But she did not deceive me. "I'm sure she's fretting about my dear papa, and I'm quite miserable." Poor Fanny's spirits bore testimony to the sincerity of her heart. The visit finished without amusement, and she returned home dejected. No sooner was she departed than Maria carried this inexplicable tale to her aunt's apartment. She was enjoying a pool at quadrille with a party of her most confidential friends, and when Maria entered had actually taken in with her cards the 3 matadors, and "I play alone" hung on her lips. From habit rather than expectations, she suspended her purpose in order to ask Maria whether she had heard any news. Thus invited, Maria detailed the conversation of the afternoon, and, curious in her turn, listened to the inferences and comments it would draw for her own better information. Mrs. Dormer and her friends listened with an interest which banished quadrille from their thoughts. Maria now heard half-concealed doubts of Mr. Baxter's circumstances passing round the table. 4 female servants and 2 men servants with the carriage were not kept for nothing. Mrs. Baxter was a very easy mistress. It was a pity she had not remembered a little better the fortune she brought her husband. 2,000 or 3,000 pounds was no great matter, and little adequate to the expense of such a family. Mr. Baxter, it was said, was rich when he married, but who could tell what the fortune of a commercial man was? And his marrying a woman for love was no proof of his being above the want of a fortune, although it was a pretty strong one of his being above prudential considerations. They confessed they were not surprised. They had long expected something to transpire from that quarter. Maria, who entered little into these observations or reflected on the want of discretion which had occasioned them, now recalled her aunt's attention to her cards, for Maria was a tolerable adept at the card-table. The old lady therefore finished the pool by the triumph of her matador game, and the party separated. Before the following day had closed, Mr. Baxter was a ruined man, had escaped from his creditors and gone off to Holland. A person who had a large sum of money in Mr. Baxter's hand was instantly alarmed by this whispered but widely circulating report, and consulting more his own security than the truth of the rumour, took such measures as the laws of this country have provided for such cases. These necessary steps brought him before Mrs. Baxter, and the suspicions which alone rendered them necessary were inhumanly and bluntly avowed to the unhappy woman. Terrified by this, as she conceived, irrecoverable shock on the credit of her husband, and knowing the vexatious circumstance that had hurried him to London, her alarmed spirits seized as inevitable all the dreadful consequences of his ruin to herself and her children. She was instantly attacked by fainting fits, to which for some time she had been subject, but they now were succeeded by strong convulsions, which in 12 hours terminated in her death. Mr. Baxter, in the meantime, was experiencing in London the sweet fruits of a life eminently distinguished by undeviating integrity and industry. Not only friends with whom time and mutual services had connected him came forward to his aid with an alacrity which was as honourable to themselves as it was useful to him, but those who knew little more of him than his reputation for talents and prudence entered with zeal into measures which the exigency of his affairs required. This arose from the capture of a very rich ship, in which Mr. Baxter was very deeply concerned. He had trusted to the ratification of peace, which had been signed by the powers in Europe, reaching the distant port at which the ship took in its valuable cargo before it was ready to sail. But it unfortunately happened that the dispatch was beyond his calculations, and the vessel became the prize of the enemy, at a moment, however, which rendered it an equivocal capture. His commercial friends unanimously determined to support him in trying to establish the illegality of the prize, and during the detention of the ship to assist him with their credit. Reassured by this support, and satisfied that the blow was not so heavy as in the first moment of surprise he had apprehended, he wrote a letter of comfort to his beloved wife, conjured her to be cheerful, assured her that every cloud was dissipated, and that in the course of a few more days he hoped to be happy in the bosom of his family. With this letter he dispatched Mr. Jackson, his clerk, referring her to him for every other detail. Poor man! The object of his first and last care stood in need of no earthly consolation. All that remained of the duties of love and of respect was to consign her mortal frame to its parent earth. The spirit which had animated it was returned to its Maker, and enjoying the recompense of a well-spent life. Mr. Jackson, who had known Mrs. Baxter from her childhood, in performing the last duties to her remains, paid that tribute of grief at her grave which her wretched husband was the victim of in town. Harassed by his late business and fatigued by continual hurry, the shocking intelligence of Mrs. Baxter's death, though communicated to him with every caution that friendship could suggest, totally subdued him. A violent fever followed, during which his life was for some days despaired of. When this alarm had passed, Mr. Baxter found he had nothing in Bristol to interest his mind but his children. These he knew had been under my care and roof from the first saddening hour, and I have reason to hope that he was assured of their comforts. He now therefore listened to an offer urgently pressed on him by his London friends, namely, remaining there as partner in a branch of commerce at once solid and lucrative. Mindful of every engagement of honour and generosity, Mr. Baxter connected his faithful friend Mr. Jackson with himself in the business carried on at Bristol, and this gentleman succeeded to his place in the house and to those concerns in which he had for so many years assisted. Mr. Litchford had happily convinced the timid and ungenerous creditor that he had no foundation for his alarms, and the man, struck by the effects which his hasty proceedings had occasioned, mentioned with expressions of sorrow the quarter from whence the communication of Mr. Baxter's insolvency had come to his ears. This was without a doubt from the bedchamber of Mrs. Dormer, and it called upon us for such inquiries as naturally suggested themselves on such an occasion. Mrs. Baxter, a sister of my poor friend, had on the first alarm joined the unhappy family. She was also with me, and Fanny was present when my husband related to us the particulars which I have mentioned relative to the fatal rumour which had prevailed. The dear girl turned as pale as death, and grasping my hand said, "Surely, but it cannot be. It is impossible." It is sufficient to say that her artless confession followed, and which the events I have detailed have given you. Mrs. F. Baxter, exceedingly shocked by this representation, spoke of it in all the bitterness of her sorrow to every sympathizing friend who approached her, and it became the general opinion that a girl of 12 or 13 years of age could not be ignorant of the culpability of that incitement which induced her to betray a confidence she had so powerfully solicited and so positively engaged to preserve. No one was disposed to think her youth any excuse for her fault, nor a plea of exemption from disgrace. The coterie of Mrs. Dormer had no respectability to lose, but my old friend perceived that from that hour she had survived her own. She was neglected, and her name became proverbial. Every idle story was called a Mrs. Marjorie Dormer, and the few who still paid their court to her nice suppers and card-purse went under the appellation of Mrs. Dormer's runners. As few were ambitious of this title, she insensibly became the prey of the needy and servile, and she is at this hour surrounded by a few interested and ignorant people, who, whilst they pillage her, flatter and ruin poor Maria. Mrs. Dormer is upwards of 70. Her good humour, I am told, has given place, as her infirmities have increased, to the peevishness of an old age unsupported by better principles than those which Mrs. Dormer has encouraged. Maria is closely confined to her aunt's room, and when seen it is in company little to her advantage, and I much fear for her future situation. Mrs. Litchford paused. "You have," said I, "powerfully excited my feelings for the family of Mr. Baxter and himself. Will you indulge me by saying what is their precise situation now, and in what manner the loss of such a mother has been supplied to them all, but particularly to poor Fanny?" "Oh, with pleasure," returned Mrs. Litchford, "for, except in one point, their prospects are smiling. I am now Mr. Baxter's guest, and have been so annually ever since he left Bristol. Mr. Baxter is now a very rich man in the general sense of the word, and, what is of much more importance, rich in the esteem and, I may say, veneration of those who know him. But sorry am I to add that neither the extensive usefulness of his life, nor the success with which it has pleased Heaven to crown his prudence, has been able to erase from his memory his former happiness, and from possessing the most cheerful and equal temper of mind that ever blessed man, he is now become habitually melancholy and reserved. The enjoyments of his family and friends are clouded by his pensive sadness, but never broken in upon by his caprice. He appears to value his existence only as it is useful to his children and his fellow creatures, but whilst he anxiously contributes to the comfort of all who approach him, he inflicts the pang arising from their conviction that he wants happiness himself. His family have been wisely and prudently governed by my friend Mrs. F. Baxter, and Fanny is a lovely and amiable young woman. I had a few days since a painful proof of the state and temper of Mr. Baxter's mind. A slight cold prevented my going with the young people, my husband and Mrs. F. Baxter, to see a royal review in the park. My friend Mr. Baxter was, like myself, slightly indisposed. We remained in the library, where the collected family had breakfasted. I produced my work-bag, and in jest told him we should be good company, for that I had a cough always ready to answer his, and when we are tired of this harmony, added I, you shall read to me. I thought he saw my purpose with kindness, and I exerted my powers of amusement. I succeeded. He appeared easy and cheerful. Something led me to mention his daughter, and yielding to the tender and perhaps partial love I bear her, I enlarged upon her good qualities, her improvement, her temper, and her conduct. Casting up my eyes from my work, in order to meet an acquiescent smile, to my confusion I saw my friend standing opposite a full-length picture of his wife, which filled a panel in the room. I was struck dumb, and regretted my folly. After a painful silence to me, he seemed at once to take up the subject which I had so inadvertently started. "Yes," said he mournfully, "yes, blessed be God, she is worthy of the saint who gave her. You knew, you loved," continued he, pointing to the beautiful representation of his wife, "this victim of the heedless communication of infants, this unoffending and innocent object of malignancy and imbecility, this sacrifice to suspicion and base ingratitude. You knew her. Then do not wonder that time has no soothing influence for me." He covered his face and burst into tears. I answered him with mine, to which vexation for my fault gave bitterness. At length I hazarded those arguments which religion and reason enforce as the most consolatory, and with all the warmth of affection urged to him resignation to the divine will, and his constant endeavours for a patient submission to the means appointed to produce the trial of his faith and trust in the Supreme Being. He raised his drooping head, and looking at me with anguish, said, "There again do you rouse my silent sorrow. I cannot forgive the monster who hurried to a premature grave the solace, the prop of my life, for what has been my existence without her. This wretch was well acquainted with the circumstances of my fortune. He knew I was an honest man. I had served him in a more perilous exigence of his credit than the one I was under, and had he been a man, he would have been amongst the first of my friends to have vindicated my honour and defended my wife from the babbling of fools and the fears of her own too apprehensive and too tender nature. He wrung his hands in speechless agony, and then proceeded, "Had this awful dispensation of Providence met me in its ordinary manner, I think I could with manly fortitude and Christian patience have sustained it. But to be thus separated, my very faith is shaken by my sorrows, and I have guilt as well as grief to subdue me." He sunk into gloomy silence, and left me pensively to reflect on having so incautiously awakened his acute feelings. "I have, my dear Miss Woodley," continued the amiable Mrs. Litchford, "now to apologise for the tears I have called from your eyes, but I need no apology. They are the just tribute of humanity to a man thus sorrowing, and whose excellent life has been shaded by the idle curiosity of a child." I shall finish this letter by telling my Eliza that in the following year I again saw Mrs. Litchford at Mr. Baxter's, in whose family I was become an intimate. She informed me of the death of Mrs. Dormer and the marriage of Maria. Her husband was captain of an American ship, and she left this country with him. Miss Baxter soon after married also, and on that event the family retired to a noble estate near Durham, and in the vicinity of that on which resided the young couple, Mr. Baxter, as a grandfather, appeared happy. And Mrs. Litchford informed me, some years after these events had taken place, that surrounded by his affectionate children, and engaged by a rising family, he was once more the joy of his friends, and still the father and the friend of the unfortunate. Heaven grant that my Eliza, as far as her confined circle can extend, may at his age have added a similar title to the name she has derived from her mother, Angelica Palmerston. End of chapter 2.